Welcome back to the Politics and Media programme. The Probation Service is facing its largest ever shake-up after ministers announced a widespread privatisation plan. Conservative Minister Chris Grayling plans to leave just 30% of probation contracts to public bodies. In the new scheme, more than 50,000 prisoners on short-term sentences will be given 12-month compulsory supervision orders, which could involve being barred from moving to a different area and being subject to tests for Class B drugs like cannabis. So what effect will privatising a major part of the prison system have? Will paying by results improve the probation services? How will Muslim prisoners be affected? The Islam Channel spoke to Prisons Minister Jeremy Wright.
The new privileges and incentives scheme that the government's putting forward now, is there a difficulty trying to find the right balance between rehabilitation and punishment in this sense?
Well, prison needs to do both of those things. It needs to punish and it needs to rehabilitate as well. So what we are doing is changing what's called the incentives and earned privileges scheme that operates within prisons to make it clear that prisoners need to earn their privileges not just by the absence of bad behaviour, so by avoiding punching prison officers or by damaging property in a cell, but also by demonstrating commitment towards their own rehabilitation and working to turn their own lives around.
One of the issues that I've heard raised, particularly by people like the Howard League for Penal Reform, is that there actually just isn't enough courses and training programs within prison for prisoners to actually be anything other than idle. So, I mean, do you think more needs to be done in that respect?
I think we can always make more effort to bring in purposeful activity to prisons. And there's a whole range of purposeful activity that we would want to see prisoners engaged in order to earn their privileges. It's not just, for example, work in prisons, but if you take work in prisons as one element of this purposeful activity, last year there were 800,000 more hours worked within prisons than there were the year before. So we are moving in the right direction on work in prisons, but yes, of course, it will always be a good idea to do more.
How will this affect, say, religious privileges in prisons?
Well, it will make no difference, for example, to halal food. There will still be an entitlement to halal food at any level of the IEP system. We will work very hard to make sure that within the new core working day that we will want to apply to prisons, because we do believe that prisoners should work a full working day, and we want to make the changes necessary to achieve that. But we will make every effort to ensure that we coordinate that effort to have a longer working day with a respect for religious observance.
An issue I've heard raised with regards to Muslims in prison is that Muslim communities at the moment have more of a cutting off kind of attitude as far as people when they go to prison, and there isn't enough being done to reintegrate Muslims in prison back into society when they're released. I mean, what sort of programs or what sort of programs do you think you would advocate and are working on as far as these issues go?
Well, it is, as you say, hugely important that when people leave prison, they are reintegrated into society. Almost every person who's serving a prison sentence will be released one day. So we have to think about what happens when they are. And as I said earlier, it's very important that people aren't simply released from prison, fall into the same routines, the same bad company, commit further crimes and end up back in prison again in a never-ending cycle. That's really the fundamental problem that we face within the criminal justice system. So what we want to do is make sure that people do have the support, the interventions they need when they leave custody, make sure they have access to a mentor, to somebody who will link them with the training they need, with the housing requirements that they have, with the drug counselling that they may need. All of those things are important if we're going to turn lives around.
Do you think enough is being done, or are you going to do more to cater for a specific community such as the Muslim community to make sure that, for example, with the mentor scheme, that they actually cater to the difficulties they might face?
We will do more, and we want mentors to recognise the specific needs that particular former offenders have got, whether that's because they're a Muslim prisoner or for any number of other reasons. We want mentors to identify those particular needs and to respond to them. And what we will do is put in place a system that rewards those providing rehabilitation to former prisoners for driving down those rates of reoffending. If they succeed in getting reoffending down, they will receive a financial reward for that. And they'll understand, I think, very well that if they want to drive down those rates of reoffending, they want to succeed in bringing down the rate of reoffending for each individual, then they'll need to address that individual's needs. So I think that will happen increasingly under the system that we are trying to design at the moment.
With me to discuss the government's plans are Tara McPherson, a senior researcher at the think tank Reform, and Ian Dunt, editor of the website politics.co.uk. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Tara, how will it work to make the reoffending figures reduced on the basis of a sort of paper prisoner basis?
With regards to probation, actually, so there are two slightly distinct proposals that the government have come up with. One, which you talked about, the incentive and earned privilege scheme, and then the probation proposals. With regards to probation proposals, the plan is that there will be a national probation service introduced, and this will retain the public sector involvement in the probation service, and this will account for about 20%, although there are some conflicting views at the moment, and that will focus on offenders who are of high risk, and also they will provide advice to courts and so on. And the rest of probation services, which is essentially around sort of 70%, will be contracted out to either public sector mutuals. Some probation trusts may spin off into mutuals, the private sector, or voluntary organisations. And these organisations will be paid on a payment by results scheme. The government is still coming up with it, firming up its proposals about how exactly payment by results will work in this context. But ultimately, they will be paid. The providers will be paid on how much they drive down reoffending amongst those offender groups.
Yeah, but how is that meant to work? I mean, why is it better? Why isn't it an improvement to incentivise this financially? Won't it simply lead to fiddling the figures or corruption, since what you're dealing with is a societal problem and not really amenable to the kind of, parking meter approach?
You're absolutely right. The proof will be in the pudding, and depends on how it will work. What is good is the government is actually moving generally in the right direction. One of the main positive things that is going on is that they are going to actually extend probation services to short sentence prisoners. Right now, those offenders serving 12 months or less in prison do not come into contact with the probation system at all. And they are the ones that tend to reoffend the most. Nearly 60% of those go on to reoffend in a very short period of time. So if the government is going to deal with this prisoner group, they have two options. They either increase the size of the existing probation service, and there isn't enough money to do that, or they open up the probation service to new providers, and then pay those providers based on how well they perform.
So I mean, Ian, on Tara's reading, this isn't really about efficiency in terms of bringing down reoffending rates or the probation service. It's about they haven't got the money for it.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, that's true to a certain extent, that there is almost no public service right now that isn't being cut back, and there is no investment in anything that's still kept in the public sphere. So what is that providing for us? And in this case, it's putting us into the most extraordinary experiment that we have no data for how this will work, because this has not been tried anywhere else. They really are just throwing the roulette wheel and seeing what happens. With an incredibly, potentially very dangerous area of civil society that we're going to be messing around with. We have pretty good results from our existing system. We actually have year-on-year reductions for the last 10 years in reoffending in the areas where actually probation services are still in charge, so not in the area where they've been in jail for 1 year. So instead of handing it over to one of the very few areas which are actually making genuine, solid effort on rehabilitation, it's being handed over to this extraordinary ballot, basically, of private sector and voluntary organisations, for which we have no information at all as to whether it will actually work.
I mean, Tara, I suppose there could be a prolonged debate among viewers about which of the privatised services they find most inefficient. But surely, after the whole debacle at the Olympics, the security aspect of privatisation must be pretty high up there. So what is the case for handing this group of people, who only last week a bunch of prisoners in their care in Manchester escaped? Why is this a good idea?
Well, I would hope that, given the example of what happened at the Olympics last year, the Ministry of Justice will be very careful about who they contract these services out to, and these providers will have to provide an unprecedented level of scrutiny about their own operations as well, and that's exactly what we need as a taxpayer. That's fine, but it will also open up the market to smaller charities, actually locally based resettlement charities who are dealing with offenders. Right now, there is no formal mechanism for them to actually interact with the probation service, and they are often the ones who are having to pick up the work of the mentoring services, etc. And it will be really important, and it will be absolutely crucial that they are involved in the right way. And I think, especially for your audience, this will actually mean that services can be targeted to individual groups such as Muslim prisoners in a far better way. That's certainly the aspiration.
I mean, if I can come back on the scrutiny thing, we just had the libel reform go through Parliament. One of the things libel reform did was actually protect private companies delivering public services from any restrictions on their ability to fight a libel battle. So actually, when journalists write about a private body providing public services, they are liable to a libel case, to a defamation case. They are not subject to those same legal processes when they're writing about a public body. So I think it's a very imaginative argument to say that somehow there'll be more scrutiny on private providers providing public services. All of the evidence points that actually it's the exact opposite that we'll be facing. In terms of joined-up services, it's very difficult. Whenever you privatise something, one of the main dangers is you see an atomisation of service. So, for instance, in the NHS, if you privatise, let's say, and this will be happening very soon, someone doing knee operations, that'll be fine as long as your knee operation is very easy, very, very simple operation to do. If you have complications, there can often be difficulties with information transfer between various departments of a hospital or of a health service. It's very difficult to maintain roads of communication when you have a privatised service, and there's very little to suggest that it will be possible here.
I mean, isn't that a sort of fundamental critique of this whole process, that public provision is about establishing a baseline level of service through general taxation which applies universally? And in the probation service, as in the health service, as in the provision of other social necessities, that's desirable, whereas what the private sector does is to head for the most profit.
I think that I do certainly take on the viewpoint that there is a risk there may be a fragmentation of services, because the way that the government has positioned it is that high-risk offenders will be dealt with by the public sector and low-risk offenders will be dealt with by other providers, whatever they might be. And that's one of the main criticisms of the government's proposals, and when more detail comes out about this, the government must be very, very careful about addressing this issue. But with regards to the pursuit of profit or the pursuit of public good, I think that debate is there's no point having it continuously. We might as well try and make it work. And in fact, the government is encouraging existing probation trusts to spin off into public sector mutuals. So they're expecting the same people who are dealing with who are in the probation service right now to be dealing with offenders later on, but just in a different. Through a different structure. It doesn't mean that their motivations will change. Everyone's motivations will still be about reducing reoffending.
So why do it? I mean, if everyone's motivations are the same and it's the same people doing it, why would we make these changes in the first place? I'm continually baffled. Of course, I understand the austerity argument. We're run out of money and we need to seek alternatives. Okay, so let's put that to one side for one moment, because ultimately, this is a false economy. I mean, it costs us 40 grand to keep someone in jail for a year anyway. So if we're actually going to think that we're going to save money by going to an unreliable mechanism for preventing reoffending rather than sticking with something that we know has a modest but genuine impact, then really we're losing money over time.
So do you expect something to happen, as happened with the sort of marketisation of the health service, that in reality what it did is it boosted the managerial layer absolutely massively? So going from 8% being spent on it, it went to 16, is now nearer 20. Do you think that something like that will happen with probation?
Undoubtedly, there usually is an increase in bureaucratisation. But I think also we could be setting ourselves up for some potentially quite dangerous social phenomena as well. So take risk is highly volatile. Someone is considered low risk, but we know that he has a difficult relationship with the wife at home. Still, he's a low-risk individual. This is how, currently we would treat him. The neighbours phone up the police and say they've heard shouting in that home from the kitchen. Suddenly, actually, he should be considered high risk, or at least medium, that there's a chance of domestic violence taking place. In that kind of situation, you want all services communicating with each other directly and very, very easily. That previously was actually quite easy because the police were working with the public services that were delivering it. Now we're going to splinter it, not just into contractors, but subcontractors. And the idea that all of this information will be centrally controlled so that we can make cogent and realistic assessments of risk, I think is very unrealistic.
I would disagree with the fact that the police are now working with probation and prisons in a seamless fashion, and that the government is trying to tear it all apart. I mean, that is simply just not the truth. If that was the case, we wouldn't have 60% of people going on to reoffend if their sentences under 12 months, and in fact, and the figure is not that much lower for even sentences between 1 and 4 years. There is something going wrong, and that needs to be dealt with in a way that is sensible. And ultimately, the probation service, as it stands now, cannot cope with that extra demand. And so it needs to be reconfigured in some way, and bringing in new providers. And I do stress the fact that there will be voluntary sector organisations involved in this. There are many, many voluntary sector organisations that are very excited to finally be given a formal opportunity to come in and provide their expertise in local areas and local expertise, because actually the government's proposals they're saying there will be 21 commissioning areas, so there will still be a local perspective coming in, and I think that's very, very important to maintain that they are setting up a framework in a way that is moving in the right direction, but the proof will be in the pudding about whether they can do it properly or not.
Mm. The trouble is, even if all of that stands, we don't know how you would write the contract. Before you privatise something, you have to think very hard. What is exactly the contract that I'm trying to get? So it's quite easy. Say if you privatise the guy that mows the lawns in Hyde Park, that's a very easy contract to write. Like I said before, if you want to start talking about knee operations or hip operations, that's much more complicated. And in this area, it's even more complicated. So we know what reduces reoffending. We know education, improving literacy, average prisoners' literacy levels in maths and English of an 11-year-old. We know 2/3 of inmates have some sort of mental health problem. We know we have to tackle all of these problems all together, along, of course, with getting people back into work when they're often completely unused to a working environment, if they're even intellectually capable of doing it. Now, at the moment, the government's suggesting that the contract would be written by showing that there's a direct link between what you do as a voluntary group / private sector provider and the person not reoffending. Well, that's an incredibly difficult benchmark. That's a very sloppy contract, and one that you can imagine wouldn't work very well.
And I mean, one thing that there'll be concern to some viewers here is that there's a disproportionately high number of Muslims and black people, ethnic minorities in prison. A profit-based contract is surely not the best way of dealing with the specific problems that may arise in those areas.
Well, I absolutely agree that the way the contract is framed will be crucial. And right now, the government hasn't actually provided enough detail as to how long the contracts are going to be for and what are the measures that they are going to measure providers on. That's absolutely very, very important that government provides a response to that as soon as possible and does so in a sensible manner. But with regards to the actually targeting groups such as Muslims and black and ethnic minority prisoners, as long as the contract retains enough flexibility for providers to provide to input specialist expertise in dealing with those groups of people, then that's fine. But then the contract needs to be flexible as well as very strictly defined in other areas. The way the contract is defined will be very, very important.
Okay, let's have a look at another aspect of the sort of discussion about prisons that's been going on in the last week with Grayling's announcement that certain privileges are going to be withdrawn. It is, well, should we say, at least an irony that most of these privileges actually exist in private prisons, the wearing your own clothes, the watching Sky TV, precisely because that lowers the costs. So the whole thing that the Prisons Minister said in the package at the head about useful work and all the rest of it, privatising is precisely a method of moving away from that, giving them privileges, which then what I suppose soon we'll have to commonly refer to as the swivel-eyed section of the Tory party, complains most bitterly about.
I agree. I think whilst I think that the government's probation reforms are moving in the right direction, I think then recent announcements on the incentive and privilege scheme are in fact going in the opposite. I mean, the main thing is that prisons should be measured on the government's own objectives, which are reducing reoffending, protecting the public, and actually providing a safe and secure environment for prisoners. And prison governors should be given the flexibility to run their prisons in a way that is suitable to meet those objectives. And you're right, absolutely, that it's actually in private sector prisons where they've had the greater flexibility in terms and conditions that they've been allowed to exploit these. For instance, at Loudon Grange, a Serco-run prison, they have all inmates have telephones in their cells, and they also have electronic computers where they can decide what course they're going to be on, apply for a job inside prison. This means that actually security guards can go and concentrate on creating a safe environment. They're not form-filling. So this has allowed the prison to actually become one of the best prisons in the country. Prisoners have better relationships with their families and so on, but that's only because they've had that flexibility available to them. That flexibility isn't available in the public sector right now, and the IEP scheme, which is being proposed, is going to remove that even further, not just from public providers, but from private providers as well. So that innovation will be stifled.
I mean, I agree with the broad thrust. I don't think it needs to be a private prison to have that kind of flexible arrangement. But generally speaking, it's best if you leave these things to the people who actually know what's going on. When you get diktats from Whitehall, usually based in order to get a positive write-up in the Daily Mail or the Sun, you're always cruising towards a very dangerous position, people who don't know about something, dictating how it should operate to people who do know how something works. And it's quite disappointing to see that happen. This always happens with governments. They need to start speaking to their core vote, to their parliamentary backbenchers, and they start giving up on the principles that they often came into power with. The what works will do it principle is ultimately, what Michael Gove was spouting before. It's what should be behind free schools, and it's typically what was behind rehabilitation under Ken Clarke. And it's a shame to see them giving up on some of those ideas, basically because they're running scared of their own parliamentary party.
Do you think what's happening here is that the debate, it seems to be being driven from the idea that being in prison, i.e. being deprived of your liberty, is punishment, to the idea that being in prison is not sufficient punishment, and that something really pretty awful should be happening to you in there as well, rather than trying to ensure that when you come out the other side, you don't do something again. And
you always hear that dreadful nonsense, especially from right-wing columnists, and they sort of say, well, actually, it sounds like great fun if I could just sit in the room and watch TV all the time. And you just think, well, what a dreadful life you must have if the loss of your liberty would mean so little to you. And, of course, it's never going to be any sort of fun. And those siren voices, it's really the sort of, flog 'em brigade that you get with a classical Tory party. Lots of Tories do not feel this way, by the way, but they're not wielding power in the Conservative Party as it is now. So increasingly, they're going to try and throw red meat to Tory backbenchers who want a much more draconian attitude in the party. And we'll be seeing, unfortunately, more, not less of that.
Do you think that's true? Because, I mean, it seems to be that the sort of, the Tory party is in the process almost on a sort of day-by-day basis of sort of breaking free of the anchor that being in coalition gave it, and that the backbenchers now on Europe, today on gay marriage, perhaps on this issue, or already partly on this issue, we're going to see a sort of lurch to the right on the part of the government?
Well, I mean, I think that there are very conflicting messages coming out from government right now. I mean, in some respects, there are very long-term strategies being put forward, say, with the probation review, which is looking at completely restructuring the way public services are delivered. And in other regards, they appear to be very populist approaches, but actually will have an enormous effect on people's day-to-day lives, especially in prison. And for instance, with the incentive and privilege scheme, there's the issue that it might actually increase the level of suicide risk in prisons. It's actually going to be focused, the privileges are going to be taken away from some of the most vulnerable people when they first enter prison, and they'll be deprived of access to to see their family, to phone credit. These are really, really important things when you're in prison, and the government needs to be careful about the unintended consequences of populist policies such as this.
I mean, Ian, hug a hoodie, that's dead, isn't it, as a strategy for...
Yeah, it's long gone. We don't hear about the hoodies anymore, and we don't really hear about the Huskies anymore. And in fact, you know, it's even funny when you see the sort of the gay marriage vote in the Commons today. It's almost like an echo of a previous David Cameron. You know, I mean, you sort of dimly remember him once upon a time making these sorts of noises, and you just don't see it anymore. And I think in this, as in a host of areas, this process will continue. And crime and punishment has always been one of the main areas for Conservative backbenchers. I mean, when you go to conference, when Ken Clarke used to talk about the, you know, we'll do what works sort of policy, he would barely get one round of applause in the whole hall, partly because all Tories hate Ken Clarke and he's loved by everyone who votes for other parties. So there's no commitment to this idea in the Conservative Party. There's some limited commitment to some of these ideas in Downing Street. However, Downing Street right now is running a little afraid of its parliamentary party.
Okay, well, that's all we've got time for. I'd like to thank both my studio guests, Tara McPherson and Ian Dunt, for that investigation of the government's prison policy. Do rejoin us in future episodes of the Politics and Media programme, where we'll be keeping a close eye on future developments in the government.